Ibrahim Traoré's decision to allow each family in Burkina to have only 2 children has shocked the world. Why did he make such a policy against the world? What benefits does this bring to Burkina Faso and Africa? Let us analyze his policy to see that Ibrahim Traoré is not simple. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré announced that every family in Burkina Faso would be limited to 2 children, the world reacted with shock. In a region where large families were traditionally seen as a sign of strength and prosperity, this was not just a new law, it was a cultural revolution. Critics from abroad called it authoritarian. Western media rushed to frame it as a restriction of rights. But inside Burkina Faso, something different happened. People began to see it not as a punishment, but as a promise of stability, progress, and dignity. Traoré, a man known for his bold decisions, was not simply thinking about today. He was thinking about the next 10, 20, 50 years. He had studied the trajectory of African nations where unchecked population growth strained schools, hospitals, farmland, and cities. He saw how poverty persisted not because Africa lacked resources, but because resources were spread too thin. Every additional mouth to feed meant less food, less money, less attention for each child. His 2-child policy was a gamble, yes, but it was also a calculated step toward breaking the cycle of poverty. The logic was simple but profound. With 2 children, families could focus their limited resources on quality, not quantity. Instead of sending 6 children to overcrowded schools where few graduate, parents could send 2 children to schools with better supplies, better teachers, and better chances. Instead of struggling to feed many with poor diets, they could feed 2 with nutritious meals. Instead of dividing land into tiny, unsustainable plots, inheritance could remain manageable, ensuring agricultural productivity. It was not about limiting love or family bonds. It was about reimagining family strength through stability and education. And Burkinabe families quickly saw the wisdom. Mothers who had borne the heaviest burden of raising large families began to express relief. For generations, women had sacrificed education and health for the endless cycle of childbirth and care. Now, with fewer children, they could pursue careers, businesses, and community leadership. Women's cooperatives began to expand, filled with mothers who had the time and energy to invest in entrepreneurship. Empowerment was no longer a slogan, it was visible in the markets, the farms, and the offices. Traoré also understood that population policy is economic policy. With population growth stabilizing, Burkina Faso could plan its future with precision. Schools could be built to meet realistic demand. Hospitals could focus on quality treatment instead of being overwhelmed by numbers. Infrastructure from housing to electricity could match growth instead of being forever behind. Foreign investors, once hesitant because of instability, began to show interest. They saw a government with a long-term plan, one that could guarantee a workforce both educated and sustainable. But perhaps the most powerful part of Traoré's 2-child policy was its symbolic message. Burkina Faso was taking control of its destiny. For too long, African nations had been lectured by foreign agencies about family planning, often with strings attached to aid. Traoré flipped the script. This was not a foreign dictate, it was a sovereign decision, rooted in African realities and African needs. And by owning the policy, Burkina Faso restored dignity to the debate. In the first months, there were challenges. Rural elders worried that fewer children meant weaker families. Some religious leaders hesitated. But Traoré did not impose the policy with force alone. He backed it with dialogue and education. His government launched nationwide campaigns explaining the benefits: healthier families, stronger women, educated children, and a stable economy. Community leaders were invited to forums where data was shared openly. Slowly, skepticism gave way to cautious acceptance. The policy was no longer seen as a restriction, but as a tool of empowerment. The early signs were promising. Within a year, birth rates began to decline modestly. School enrollment numbers improved, as families were able to keep children in classrooms. Health clinics reported fewer cases of malnutrition among infants. And across villages, parents began speaking with a new kind of pride, not in the number of children they had, but in the opportunities their children now enjoyed. For Traoré, this was only the beginning. He often reminded the nation that the true impact would be seen not tomorrow, but in 10 years, when a generation of healthier, better educated young people would emerge. These would be the doctors, engineers, teachers, and leaders who would carry Burkina Faso forward. And he believed that one day the world would look back at this controversial policy and call it what it truly was, a visionary step towards sovereignty and prosperity. What many failed to understand was that Traoré's two-child policy was not just about numbers. It was about changing the philosophy of progress. In a land where the desert threatened farmland and resources were scarce, survival depended not on multiplying endlessly, but on cultivating wisely. And just as farmers learned to tend fewer crops with more care, families would now tend fewer children with more hope. Thus, in a single policy, Ibrahim Traoré did what many leaders never dared. He rewrote the meaning of family for the future of Burkina Faso, and in doing so he planted the seeds of a stronger, smarter, and more sovereign nation. When Ibrahim Traoré introduced the two-child policy, he was not simply trying to control population numbers. He was redesigning the foundations of Burkina Faso's economy and education system. In a country where families once struggled to raise many children with scarce resources, he envisioned a society where every child could have a desk in school, a doctor when sick, and a future full of possibilities. And by the second year of implementation, the evidence was beginning to show. Education becomes attainable for all. One of the greatest burdens in Burkinabe families was the cost of education. With 5, 6, or sometimes 10 children, parents often chose which child to send to school, while the rest stayed home to work in fields or small trades. This cycle perpetuated illiteracy and poverty for generations, but with only 2 children, parents could concentrate their resources buying books, uniforms, and paying for higher quality schools. The government, freed from the pressure of constant overcrowding, began building classrooms that matched realistic projections. Teachers were no longer drowning under classes of 70 or 80 pupils. Instead, classrooms averaged 30 to 35 students, allowing more personalized learning. Children who once might have dropped out by age 12 were now completing secondary school and aiming for universities. Traoré invested part of the national savings from reduced welfare costs into scholarship programs. A girl from a small village who once had no chance of secondary education could now receive support to study medicine in Ouagadougou. A boy whose parents used to split school fees among many siblings could now receive full backing for agricultural engineering. The two-child policy was not about limiting lives. It was about unlocking potential. Economic families, stronger futures. Economically, the policy began to show dividends. With fewer dependents, families suddenly had surplus income. Instead of stretching every coin to feed many mouths, households could save, invest in small businesses, or improve their farms. Markets in rural towns started to buzz with activity. Families bought better farming tools, sewing machines, solar panels. These investments created a ripple effect, increasing productivity and reducing poverty. The banking sector also felt the change. With stronger household incomes, microfinance institutions recorded higher repayment rates. Families that once defaulted due to endless expenses now paid back on time, and even requested larger loans to expand businesses. The economy, once choked by subsistence survival, began breathing with new entrepreneurial energy. Traoré understood that population stabilization is the hidden engine of economic growth. Countries with manageable populations can plan infrastructure, energy, and healthcare without being perpetually overwhelmed. His policy reduced the dependency ratio, the number of non-working people supported by each worker, creating what economists call a demographic dividend. Burkina Faso was now poised to harness this dividend, much like Asian countries had done decades earlier, when they combined family planning with rapid industrial growth. Women empowered. Society transformed. Perhaps the most profound economic shift was in women's lives. With only 2 children to raise, women had the time and freedom to join the workforce, start businesses, and participate in public life. Markets in Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso saw a surge of female entrepreneurs selling textiles, processed foods, and crafts. Cooperatives of women pooled resources to launch soy processing units, poultry farms, and tailoring shops. Beyond income, this empowerment reshaped society. Women, once confined to domestic roles, became visible leaders in villages and urban councils. Their voices grew stronger in decision-making about community resources, education priorities, and healthcare systems. For Traoré, this was not only economic progress, it was social justice. A nation where women thrived was a nation truly free. Health and productivity gains. Another overlooked benefit of the two-child policy was health. Fewer pregnancies meant safer motherhood, reduced maternal mortality, and stronger women's health overall. Children born into smaller families received more medical attention, vaccinations, and nutrition. By the third year, health clinics reported declining cases of infant malnutrition and improved child survival rates. Healthy children grew into more productive students, and eventually into stronger workers, reinforcing the cycle of prosperity. 10 years into the future, Traoré often reminded the nation that real results take time. He painted a picture of Burkina Faso 10 years ahead, classrooms full of literate youth, businesses run by families with capital to invest, women standing shoulder to shoulder with men in politics and commerce. Families would no longer measure pride by the number of children they had, but by the success of those children. International observers, initially skeptical, began to acknowledge the wisdom. Reports from African development institutions noted improved literacy rates, rising household incomes, and better healthcare outcomes. Burkina Faso, once written off as one of the poorest nations, was now being studied as a model of demographic transformation, a society in transition. Of course, challenges remained. Some rural areas resisted, clinging to old traditions. Enforcement was not perfect. But overall, the cultural mindset was shifting. For the first time, families discussed the future in terms of opportunity, not just survival. The two-child policy, controversial at its birth, was maturing into a cornerstone of national development. For Traoré, this was vindication. His gamble was working. He had taken a bold, unpopular step, and it was delivering results that touched every Burkinabe household. He had redefined what it meant to be a leader, not by giving speeches, but by changing lives with policy. And as Burkina Faso stood taller, the rest of Africa began to watch closely. Could a small Sahelian nation be leading the way in population management and sustainable development? Traoré believed the answer was yes. And he was determined to prove it with every classroom built, every business launched, and every child raised with dignity. When President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the National Assembly to defend the two-child policy, he was not only thinking about families or the economy. He was looking decades into the future, imagining what kind of society Burkina Faso could become if its people lived in balance with their land, their communities, and their dreams. The policy, controversial at its birth, gradually began to show its social and environmental effects, transforming the very fabric of the nation. The first major impact was social stability. In a country where rapid population growth often led to fierce competition for scarce resources, limiting family size eased pressure at the grassroots level. Land disputes that once erupted between neighbors started to decline, as fewer children meant reduced fragmentation of farmland. In villages, the age-old fights over inheritance and grazing rights became less frequent, giving space for dialogue instead of conflict. Youth gangs in urban areas, often formed from young men with no jobs and no education, started to shrink in size. With better educated children and stronger family economies, fewer teenagers were idle on the streets. Crime statistics began to drop, and law enforcement officers reported more peaceful neighborhoods. The two-child policy was quietly disarming the root causes of unrest. Beyond stability, the environmental benefits were striking. Burkina Faso's greatest threat had always been desertification. Families with many children cut more trees, grazed more livestock, and exhausted the soil. But with fewer mouths to feed, the demand for firewood decreased, and communities were able to replant forests and conserve land. Government programs paired with the two-child policy focused on sustainable farming methods, soil restoration, and water management. The results were visible. Once barren fields turned green with millet and sorghum, and rivers that had been drying too early in the season began to flow longer. International organizations monitoring climate resilience took note, praising Burkina Faso for aligning family planning with ecological recovery. Traoré's gamble was not only about people, it was about healing the land. The two-child policy also changed the way families planned for the future generation. In the old days, children were often viewed as labor for farms. The more children, the more hands available to till the soil. But in the new Burkina Faso, children were increasingly seen as investments in knowledge. Parents no longer measured success by the number of boys who could herd cattle, or the number of girls who could fetch water. Instead, they spoke proudly of daughters in nursing school, sons in engineering colleges, and children learning technology in city centers. Traoré understood that a modern nation could not survive on muscle alone. It needed minds. And the two-child policy ensured that every mind received the nourishment of education. Another overlooked benefit was the reduction of child marriage. In many rural areas, poverty forced parents to marry off daughters early, because feeding many children was impossible. With smaller families and stronger household incomes, parents could keep their daughters in school instead of giving them away in teenage marriages. Girls who once faced a life of domestic servitude now had the chance to become doctors, teachers, and entrepreneurs. Women's rights advocates in Ouagadougou and abroad hailed this as a quiet revolution, led not by protests, but by population policy. At the community level, the change was visible in everyday life. Families that once struggled to provide 3 meals a day were now eating better food, with more variety and nutrition. Children wore cleaner clothes, carried books to school, and dreamt bigger dreams. Mothers had more time for themselves, often joining literacy programs, agricultural cooperatives, or small businesses. Fathers, no longer crushed by endless financial burdens, could save money, buy land, or build homes with dignity. The psychological stress of poverty began to ease, replaced by cautious optimism. Critics abroad accused Traoré of imposing Western-style population control, but his defenders pointed out the difference. This was not an external project, but an African-designed solution to an African reality. Unlike colonial programs that disrespected human rights, the two-child policy in Burkina Faso was accompanied by massive investments in healthcare, free contraception access, and widespread education campaigns. Families were not coerced, they were persuaded by the evidence that smaller households meant stronger futures. Over time, what began as a directive turned into a cultural shift, with couples themselves proudly declaring, "2 is enough." International reaction was mixed. Some governments worried that a smaller population might limit Burkina Faso's labor force in the future. Others, however, saw wisdom in the move. The African Union began debating whether the Burkinabe model could be adapted to other Sahelian countries where population growth outpaced economic development. In Addis Ababa, Traoré argued that Africa's strength would not come from being the most populous continent, but from being the most capable. 1 billion educated Africans, he declared, are worth more than 2 billion starving ones. His words sparked conversations across the continent. Perhaps the greatest testament to the policy's success was the hope it generated among young people. For the first time, a generation grew up believing they had real opportunities ahead. Instead of preparing for a lifetime of scarcity, they were preparing for a future of innovation. Youth groups began forming startups, agricultural ventures, and social projects. Universities saw surges of applicants in technology, medicine, and environmental studies. The new Burkina Faso was not just feeding its children. It was inspiring them. In the broader arc of African history, Traoré, child policy, may be remembered as one of the most radical social reforms of the 21st century. It attacked poverty at its root, reduced social tensions, protected the environment, and laid the foundation for a generation of educated, empowered citizens. It was a gamble, yes, but one rooted in vision, courage, and love for his people. And as the decade moved forward, one truth became undeniable. By daring to reshape family structures, Traoré had also reshaped the destiny of his nation. 10 years after Ibrahim Traoré announced the two-child policy, Burkina Faso looked very different from the fragile state, once written off as a landlocked country, doomed by poverty and desertification. The gamble that seemed impossible to many outsiders had turned into a framework for national renewal, and as the years unfolded, the benefits multiplied across every sector of society, proving that this was not merely population control, but a blueprint for national rebirth. Demographic dividend in action. By the second decade, the demographic dividend that economists had predicted was in full effect. Fewer dependents meant that the working-age population now carried less financial burden. The average household income nearly doubled compared to a decade earlier. Urban centers like Ouagadougou, Bobo-Dioulasso, and Koudougou became hubs of new industries, agro-processing plants, solar technology centers, and software startups. These industries were powered by a new generation of youth, who had been educated in smaller, better-funded classrooms. Instead of exporting raw materials only, Burkina Faso was now exporting skills and finished products. A healthier, educated generation. The healthcare sector provided another striking transformation. With fewer children per household, the government was able to channel resources into specialized services. Modern maternity wards, child nutrition programs, and advanced vaccination campaigns. Maternal mortality rates fell drastically, while life expectancy rose. Families reported healthier diets because limited family sizes meant they could afford more vegetables, protein, and milk. Children grew taller, stronger, and smarter, scoring higher in international literacy and math benchmarks. Education became the beating heart of this transformation. Classrooms once overcrowded now thrived with engaged students. Universities expanded, offering new faculties in engineering, medicine, and environmental sciences. Scholarships funded by savings from reduced dependency ratios allowed hundreds of young Burkinabe to study abroad and return home with knowledge. This created a virtuous cycle. The nation invested in its youth, and the youth reinvested their talents back into the nation. Social cohesion and equality. Perhaps the most profound success was in social cohesion. With fewer economic pressures, tensions between ethnic groups, between urban and rural communities, and even between generations began to ease. Parents could provide equally for sons and daughters, reducing gender bias. The incidence of child marriage dropped sharply, as parents no longer felt pressured to marry off their daughters early. Women, with fewer children to raise, took on new roles in local councils, cooperatives, and businesses. Gender equality advanced not through slogans, but through the quiet power of economic and social restructuring. Communities that once fought over land or water began cooperating to develop shared irrigation systems, community schools, and village health clinics. The two-child policy gave people breathing room, and in that space, trust was rebuilt. Violence decreased, and local leaders began to speak of a Burkinabe peace. A stability rooted not in military power, but in the simple reality of manageable family sizes and equitable resource distribution. Economic expansion beyond borders. The effects did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. Neighboring countries took notice. Delegations from Mali, Niger, and Chad visited to study the policy's implementation and its results. Traoré, ever the Pan-Africanist, offered technical assistance, training programs, and data-sharing platforms. He argued that Africa's independence would never be secure until population, resources, and education were aligned. Internationally, Burkina Faso became an example for sustainable development. Instead of being dependent on aid, the country began negotiating trade deals on equal terms, exporting not only agricultural products, but also policy models. Development agencies that once pushed foreign-designed population control programs now looked to Ouagadougou for African-led solutions. Challenges and adaptation. Of course, challenges remained. Some regions resisted the policy, holding on to traditions of large families. Urban migration increased, creating pressures on housing and infrastructure. But Traoré's government adapted, introducing flexible community programs that balanced cultural respect with national priorities. More importantly, the spirit of the nation had shifted. People no longer saw family planning as a foreign imposition, but as a patriotic contribution to building a stronger Burkina Faso. A vision for 20 years ahead. Looking 20 years into the future, the outlines of Traoré's vision became clear. By stabilizing population growth, he had given Burkina Faso time to educate its children, modernize its economy, and protect its environment. He often reminded the nation that the wealth of a nation is not in its numbers, but in its people's capacity. His leadership turned what was once a desperate measure into a long-term strategy for sovereignty. Projections showed that by 2045, Burkina Faso would no longer be classified as one of the world's poorest nations. Instead, it was on track to become a middle-income country, with a highly educated workforce, sustainable agricultural exports, and a resilient social fabric. Families with 2 children would raise doctors, engineers, teachers, and entrepreneurs who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the world's best. A nation that chose its destiny. What made Traoré's policy truly historic was not just the numbers or the economic growth, but the dignity it restored to the people. Families were no longer trapped in endless cycles of poverty. Children no longer faced the fate of being uneducated laborers. Women no longer had to bear children endlessly at the expense of their health and potential. For the first time in modern history, Burkina Faso had chosen its own destiny, not dictated by donors, not imposed by outsiders, but written by its own people, under the guidance of a young leader who dared to see further than tomorrow. And so, when future historians write about Ibrahim Traoré, they may not speak first of his military uniform or his speeches. They may instead remember the simple, radical truth he gave to his people: 2 children are enough to build a strong nation. From barren fields to hopeful classrooms, from hungry families to thriving businesses, Burkina Faso rose as proof that wisdom, courage, and foresight could rewrite the destiny of a people. And in that rise, Africa itself caught a glimpse of what was possible when leadership embraced not fear but vision. Ibrahim Traoré's bold 2-child policy reshaped Burkina Faso's future. What began as a controversial gamble became a foundation for education, healthcare, and economic growth. Families invested more in each child, women entered the workforce, and poverty cycles broke. Social stability replaced conflict, desertification slowed, and communities thrived. Within a decade, Burkina Faso moved towards self-reliance, inspiring Africa with a model of balance between population and resources. Traoré proved true leadership means vision, courage, and long-term sovereignty.